Hello, Read 581, and welcome to week 11. We are just really flying along here with only, 4 weeks of content left after this? Good grief. This week we are focused on strategies for comprehension, specifically within the genre of narrative, and then next week we'll take a look at informational. So your readings for this week consist of the following. First, in instructing students, I'd like you to read Chapter 11, Comprehension of Narrative Text. I would prioritize this piece as I think it's the most helpful. And then also Core Teaching Reading, Chapter 14, Comprehension of Narrative Text is a nice supplement to that, gives you additional strategies, ideas, and approaches, so you can skim that. And then if you happen to have the next step forward, Chapter 7 is on moving forward with comprehension. So I've listed that as optional. If you have it available, this would be a good time to take a look at that. If you do not have Next Step Forward, I wanted to show you what you're missing out on from Chapter 7. But basically, she believes that there are 12 top comprehension strategies, and only these 12 are the ones really needed. And so here are the 12 listed here, and then a description of what that looks like as far as reader behaviors. And then for each of these 12 strategies, she provides modules directed at the different strategies. Now, how do you know what module to start with? Well, you can look at your assessment results and determine what the student is lacking, or you can just start with Module 1, which I have here, and then go in sequential order through the modules. Now, with the module, it's recommended that it be taught utilizing a gradual release of responsibilities. So there are directions for, how to tackle this whole class mini lesson using an appropriate picture book or a short passage, and then you're going to model one of the steps and then have the student work with a partner to practice it. And then you can thread the strategy into your guided reading, etc. And here are also tips for independent practice. Now, obviously you're in the one-on-one setting, so you're not going to be doing whole class, but this is a good time to remind you that you can't just tell the student what to do, but you actually need to model it probably multiple times, have them practice it, give them feedback before you actually see them applying these things. So just a note about that. All right, where are we as far as our schedule for the course? We are now in week 11, talking about comprehension part 1. Next week, we finish up comprehension. You do have those whippers due for session 7 and 8, which is the last formal collection of whippers next week. It's hard to believe we're at that point already. Week 13, we're talking about severe needs. Between weeks 13 and 14 is where the fall break falls. Remember, you could take advantage of that time by doing your last intervention session there, so you could get started with your final assessment report. And then week 14, we're talking about English language learners and special needs students. That is now where your video reflection number 2 is due. And if you want to submit these whippers, you can. In regard to our coaching cycle, the post-observation conferences are starting November 1st. So please double check the Google Scheduler and see make sure you've signed up first of all, and then see where your time is so that you can be sure and submit me your video observation at least 3 days prior to that meeting time to allow me enough time to watch it several times and do some selective scripting and plan my coaching questions and conversation with you. So we are going to be in the next few weeks actually wrapping up our observations and post-observation debrief so that then you can apply things to your last few sessions and then do the video reflection. So what's due this week? You're doing student intervention session number 7, and you're not turning anything in, but be sure that you keep on top of your whippers because those will be due next week with session 8. Things to keep on your radar is that observation video. I need that 3 days before your post-observation meeting. You don't need to complete any paperwork. I don't need any reflection on it, just the video. Week 12, whippers for session 7 and 8 are due. After week 13 is our fall break. When we come back, video reflection number 2 is due. And then week 15, 16, technically it's due in week 16, but it's the Tuesday of finals week is when your final progress report and caregiver letter is due. So quickly, I'm going to highlight some things for strategies for comprehension of narrative and share a few of my favorites with you, and we'll go from there. So this week we're continuing on these same objectives. Really at this point in the course though, looking at research to make your decisions for how you are planning your sessions, because we want to be using research-based interventions that you are pulling from one of our sources for the course so that you know that you are giving the most effective instruction possible. So not only are you designing effective instruction, but you're delivering it, which means you should really be monitoring the effectiveness and doing some sort of formative assessment or observation throughout. And then as always, being very reflective in your whippers and through our coaching conversations and the video reflection so that you truly are improving your practice as an interventionist. And I feel confident that we are working on these things very much so this semester. So chapter 11 is on narrative comprehension. They open with the quote, "Everything we do in reading instruction should be aimed at helping students comprehend written material." Many of you, probably all of you, have a comprehension goal for your student. If not, we know that within our intervention session, we shouldn't just be focused on decoding and word recognition, but we want students to be actually now reading connected text, practicing applying those word recognition skills in context, but then still monitoring that they are comprehending what they're reading, because if they're just calling words, then we don't want to reinforce that behavior, and we don't want to give them the understanding that good reading just means I can read accurately and quickly without having any knowledge of what I've just read. So even if you're not focused on comprehension, which I know many of you are, we still want to be including comprehension work in our sessions in one way or another. What is comprehension? Well, in order to be successful with comprehension, you need a knowledge of language. So you need to understand what the words mean, how they fit together, sentence structure, syntax, etc. And then you also need to have knowledge of the world, which you, I'm sure, have heard a lot about in relation with schema theory. So that theory proposes that what you already know or don't know about a topic can greatly influence your comprehension. And we talked a little bit about that when we were doing assessments initially, and that's why we assess the familiarity level of the student with the text, because if they're not familiar with it, they're less likely to understand it. And so then you might want to try a text at that same level that they are familiar with and see if that makes a difference. Same thing, if you want them to be reading something in your session with fluency, it's best that you pick something that they have a familiarity with so that they're more likely to understand what they're reading. Narrative text can actually be fiction or nonfiction. Sometimes it's assumed that narrative just means fiction, but that's not necessarily the case. You can have nonfiction narratives like biographies sometimes, but they have a specific, structure and are descriptions, and they, contain certain elements, character, setting, plot, etc. And so it's very important that we teach students this story structure, but they are descriptions of events that can be fiction or nonfiction, written or oral. And it is pretty widely accepted that comprehending narrative text is usually easier than informational text, a lot of times because the topics and themes they cover are more familiar to the student, as well as the language used more closely mirrors our oral language than what's found in something informational that's usually a little more academic. All right, I wanted to draw your attention to a few things within the text, and that is first, they have a case study of Frederick, who is a phenomenal reader. In fact, the tutor was pretty concerned that he was misreferred because he, I believe, is a third grader and was even able to read from the fourth grade book without any errors. And so his issue ended up being higher level reasoning skills, and it goes through kind of how they determined that and what his specific issues were that. So you can read about that on page 410. Additionally, I'd like you to check out table 11.2 on page 412. It goes over the many sources of error possible when answering inference questions. So I know in your initial assessment report, I was asking you, what is the specific issue with comprehension? And a lot of times it was, well, implicit comprehension is the issue. But that's not really a thorough enough analysis, because within the area of implicit comprehension or inferencing, there are so many things that can go wrong. So really looking at the specific question types and what skills they require of the reader. And so in this table, they give you what looks like maybe 30 different errors that can go wrong, starting with even simply, misreading the question or misinterpreting the question are two of the things. And then obviously in order to make an inference, you need to recall information from the text. So if you're not able to do that accurately, then that's going to skew your inference. And so then on page 413, they give you a graph that shows you what the most common errors are. And it looks like the most popular problem is too heavily relying on background knowledge, which is also called excessive elaboration, where I'm just responding, using what I know instead of actually looking for support from the text. Another common problem is the answer isn't fully developed. It might be partially correct, especially if it's in writing. Maybe they weren't able to clearly communicate their idea. So good to be aware of just all of the things that can break down when you're measuring inferencing, because then this is how you can target your instruction. All right, moving into a discussion of what good comprehension instruction looks like. I love this quote: comprehension instruction should be instructive. What does that mean? It means you're not just simply asking questions. And that was a pretty popular study by Durkin. And they found that comprehension instruction, prior to 90s, I want to say, was not actually comprehension instruction. The teacher just asked comprehension questions and called that, quote, comprehension instruction. There wasn't modeling or thinking aloud or gradual release of responsibility. So you want to make sure that you're actually teaching something, teaching comprehension, which, as we know, comprehension is a matter of constructing meaning. And for that reason, instruction should really emphasize activities that require a depth of processing. And the best way to do this is through explicit instruction. So it fully and clearly expresses and teaches the student what must be done. So teachers are modeling, they're thinking aloud. They should offer students guidance on how to comprehend, give them hints and prompts for interpreting text and doing this in a systematic way. They should be teaching strategies, which are deliberate, conscious behaviors, not just teaching the strategies, but how to apply them in different settings and how to be strategic. And then using the gradual release of responsibility to initially provide some scaffolding and more support of the teacher that you eventually take away. As a reminder, there are different levels of comprehension. Most familiar is the literal level, and I'm sure it's not surprising that a majority of the questions students are being asked are in fact at the literal level, which is a problem because this explains why they maybe have difficulty with inference level questions, because what did it say? 70% of questions asked by teachers are literal. So if we want students to get better at inferencing, we need to start by changing the types of questions we're asking. So literal comprehension is important. And if students are not getting that literal comprehension, it's impossible to do these higher levels of comprehension. So we want to make sure they're monitoring what they're reading and do have that literal level. But at the same time, we want to move on to interpretive levels, so reading between the lines, and then creative and evaluative reading beyond the lines. So interpretive is also known as inferential, creative and evaluative applied and strategic thinking there. And then the chapter finishes up with just a ton of research-based interventions and strategies, and it's broken down nicely for things that can be applied before reading, during reading, and after reading. And then they also make it a point to remind you that there are strategies that are going to help with the immediate text, like previewing this specific text, right? But that's not going to be a strategy that's going to carry over and help them with other texts. So it's important that our instruction not only help them with the current text, but texts that they're going to come to next and beyond the current text. All right, to wrap up, I wanted to share with you two different strategies, which is funny, came from one of my course texts from the program that I still use and rely on because I thought it was a great text. It's called Content Area Literacy, 5th edition, by Manzo, and Thomas. And in the chapter, which is focused on during reading strategies, in fact, it's on strategies for monitoring and fixing up, is this idea called About Point. And I know I shared it with you for, a few of you got this when we talked for our pre-observation calls. But for About Point, it's an easy to remember formula for strategic reading. You teach students to pause at logical points, such as at the end of paragraphs, and complete this sentence frame. This section is about da-da-da, and the point is da-da-da. So this really makes sure that they are monitoring what they're reading, and that helps you see if they're able to translate what they've read into, their own words and a basic understanding of the text. And then in order to state the author's probable intent for presenting just this information in just this way. So here's some samples of what that can look like. But if you just wanted to focus on literal comprehension, monitoring, you could just, have them pause, flip over the text so they're not looking at it, and have them retell you in their own words. As we know, retelling is a really important skill that they need to be able to do for comprehension. The other strategy I like a lot is called the 3-level guide. And this is a great way of thinking about the questions you are asking so that you aren't just asking literal questions, but planning your questions ahead of time into a 3-level guide. So your 3rd level of question is directed at those higher levels of comprehension. And so, in order to be able to answer this question, you want to backwards map questions that lead to being able to answer this question. So the guide alerts readers to the information and ideas needed to respond to the questions or activities in part 3. So kind of here, you're prepping them for what is to come. So you want to decide part 3 first, and then that's going to help you select the details that they need to know for part 1 of the 3-level guide, and then the inferences they're going to need to make for part 2. And so this gives you more information about that, but I thought this was a great way to plan how you're going to scaffold students to be able to think intelligently about your, creative or evaluative level question, because you can't just jump in right to that without first making sure they have a basic level of understanding and then can inference before getting to that point. So that is what I wanted to share with you. Have a great week with your student. Make every minute count. We've only got 3 intervention sessions left, so have a great week.